A squeaky floor will drive you crazy. Laying these chipboard sheets seems simple, but if you get it wrong, thickness, edge treatment, movement joints, screw type, glue, joist centres, prepare for creaking floors and an unhappy life. I laid this floor in an afternoon and I'll show you my simple rules to get a perfect floor every time. Choice of boards first, and if I'm building inside I'll make sure to use treated flooring grade green chipboard, but anywhere where I'm exposed to the outside, like here for example, I'll go for a surface laminated sheet. Now, although we're thinking about completed build, in the meantime we want the chipboard down to create a working platform which we can build our walls and roof from before we're wind and watertight. It's a real pain to have to tiptoe over joists while you're building the walls, but damp and rain destroys chipboard, and for that reason I'll use a laminated chipboard sheets which have a protective synthetic coating. I'm using Eager Protect here, and they're about a third more expensive than normal flooring grade chipboard, but the benefits make them well worth it. Pretty much waterproof, stain proof, and they create the perfect work surface for your build in our damp climates while you're working outdoors. You have two choices of chipboard thickness. Conventional recommendation is to use 18mm for 400 centres or 16 inches and 22mm for 600 centres or 24 inches, but I've seen 400 centred flooring and 18mm chipboard that's required to be stiffened, so I'll always go for 22mm over 18 because that 4mm does make a difference, and I'll always use centres around the 400mm mark. Be paranoid about eliminating creaks. Plan your layout before you start work, and rookie error first, make sure you have the bottom size facing down. This side down will be printed on your boards, but in tiny writing, so easy to miss. I'll always lay from the two female edges so I'm able to glue the tongue of the fixed board and knock the female long edge of the loose board into the fixed boards. Now you must check to see that your walls are perpendicular or square with each other. If it's new build, hopefully that should be easy if you have been disciplined with your 3, 4, 5 triangles. For a renovation, you'll often find the walls aren't square and you need to avoid getting to the ends of your room and finding you've got a tiny slither of chipboard which is impossible to fix properly. Knowledge is power, and by checking your walls before you start, by measuring the distance at 3 or 4 points beforehand, you'll see if there is a discrepancy, or if there's going to be a tiny skinny cut, you can solve this by cutting your starting boards in half and you'll have a lovely wide end cut at the end. If my walls are indeed squint, I'll ping a chalk line along each line of the boards to see what my cuts are going to look like, so I am prepared. I use that visual knowledge to decide how to start my boards at the other end. Get a chalk line, you'll use it everywhere. Take 10 minutes of your life to familiarise yourself with it. It's one of these beautiful, elegant and simple tools that sets you free once you see how effective it is. It brings us closer to that knowledge that's been passed down to us by master builders. For your quantity of boards, find the overall area of your room in square metres and divide by 1.44 the area of a board. And I'm using SketchUp to help me here, but sketching it out and just dividing it by the board lengths is also fine. Board sizes are 600 by 2 400mm, excluding the tongues, so you can just measure your room and double check your offcuts. You're aiming to lay the boards using a stretcher bond or staggered method, where the offcut of the end board is then used as the starting board of the new row at the other end. Unless you're having a perfect room shape, you're going to have a bit of wastage. Whatever you do, don't end up in a situation where you under order. I've found to my cost that merchants routinely change their suppliers, and any new boards you order often don't fit with the tongue and the groove of your laid boards since they've changed the manufacturer without telling you. Let's talk glue. The lovely thing about tongue and groove is that I don't have to worry about the board joints landing on a joist, provided I use the right glue. So I'll use a foam glue that fills and expands into and around the male-female joints, eliminating any air gaps, creating a continuous bond to make the individual boards act together as one big sheet the size of the room. There are a number of foam glues. Gorilla Glue is good. I've found this, I think it's Sudal, works well. Even as you reach the bottom of the tube, it keeps flowing. And I don't bother with the extra cost of the 5-minute curing glue. 30-minute is just fine, as well as cheaper. And for best results, make sure the glue is slightly warmed if you're working in cold weather to get it to flow consistently as you drag it along the tongue of the board. I don't bother with PVA glue now, and neither should you. I don't think it works as effectively compared to expanding foam glue. I only run glue over my joists where I'm doing renovation work and where I can overcome some twisted or out of level joists. For this conversion, I'm either doubling up the existing joists or adding in additional framing to level out the floor, and pay really a close attention to your levels, as it's that which has the greatest potential for creaks as the boards twist over the uneven joists, and the tiny gaps are what create and grow the creaks. Now for new build and house extensions like this micro home build, I'll assume you can get your joists dead level, and so I never glue the joists, I just glue the joints of the boards. The only additional framing I will do is to catch the short ends of the boards as they're unsupported at the end of the run. And here I'm screwing a 50 by 50 treated batten 300mm in length into the floor frame at the beginning and the end of each row, and I'm careful to allow my insulation to continue underneath so avoid any cold spots and cold bridges. I'll stack my boards orientated in the position that I want to lift them in place before I start, so facing the right way up and tongues positioned in the way I'm going to lay them, and I'll dry fit a couple just to get my head round the scale of the project. Preparation brings us closer to perfection. For all timber sheet materials, we need to think about expansion. I'll place these 10mm packers against both of the walls that butt against the starting sheet, or if it's new build like here, I'll place packers against my sole plate where my walls will be going, and then I'll place my first board. And side note, if you're doing timber frame construction, never take your chipboard under your walls. If you're wondering why, take a look at my other videos here where I'm going into it in detail. I'll cut the tongue off my first board to get a clean starting edge, and then I'm off. I'm using these countersunk self-driving torque screws with an impact driver. Plenty of good screw manufacturers to choose from, but make sure you have a straight shank. Avoid threads all the way up. Always opt for a Torx driver over a posi head. I hope I get the pronunciation right with those ones. Less likely to chew the thing up since you are self-tapping into the boards. For the length of the screw, we need to use the 2.5 rule. Our thickness multiplied by 2.5 and rounded up, so 22 by 2.5 gives us 60mm screw length, and with a TX20 driver bit into our impact driver, and we use an extended barrel to help us eyeball the screws in vertically. Don't use nails for chipboard, but if you're stubborn, if you feel you must, use ring shank galvanized nails, and you'll have to glue the joists as well as the joists, and even then you're risking squeaks. Fixing the boards now, and I'm only going along the long end, the farthest from my tongue with my screws, and I'm stopping 2 joists short at the short end, and this will allow some flexibility in the boards to slot in the adjoining boards. Screwing along these edges can make it impossible to fit in otherwise, especially when you're alone like I am here. I'm driving the head to countersink just at the surface. Before I go any further, I'll mark the joist positions along the exposed edge with a permanent marker, and once you get your new board joint in, it's amazing how much harder it is to find the joists with your screws by trying to eyeball it. I'll keep going until I get to the end of the row, where I'll cut the end of my board using a set square to get the edge perpendicular. Draw my pencil line and then cut. I'm using a cordless circular saw with a 25 tooth blade, and I've set my blade to 24mm, just a smidgen above the sheet thickness. Good for my battery, good for my saw motor, and good for my safety. As long as the remaining board is 350mm or more, I'll use that to start my new row. I want to catch that first joist with the cut board. Below 350 in length, I'll just start with a new board. And remember to reuse the packers to start your new row to keep that perimeter gap consistent. It doesn't need to be perfect. If you have an irregular shape like I have here on this diagonal, cut the angle first and then cut the board square with the set square. I'll run a 10mm bead of glue along the tongues, and then I'll gently tap in the loose board using an offcut of timber. And never tap in against the tongues, you'll definitely break them, which renders the board useless. Place the knocking timber on the edge above the tongue and tap it in. And working alone, you might have to temporarily fasten at one end with the screw to stop the board rotating out of its joint as you tap the other end, and focus on getting those tongues perfectly aligned. If you get a few millimeters out, you'll find it starts to amplify itself as you fill out the floor, and it gets harder and harder to get those grooves to union into the G grooves as you go along the room. Working along these boards, add in only screws to the new board as before, and mark on your joist positions with your marker pen. And with all the boards fitted, we can fix the rest of our screws using our felt pen marks. I'll drive one screw in at each edge about 25mm in to avoid crushing the tongues, and then one in the centre, and then one each between the centre, and this is an easy way to get your required 5 screws per joist without having to measure it. I'll use a floor scraper to level off the glue after it's set, sweep up, and I'm done. See my video here about how to create the perfect joist spacing for both your chipboard and your underfloor insulation. Hit me a thumbs up if you got something from this, as it really does make a big difference to me, and I hope to see you again.